born in Hamburg, Germany. He was a German Jew, and his name was Adolf Lewison. And he was from a family in Germany, a modest mercantile family. They dealt in all the things that a mercantile variety of products. They specialized in feathers back then, Maureen, and feathers to adorn a lady's cap, feather quill pens and that. But they were a modest family. But the father of Adolf Lewison knew that if his sons were truly going to be make it big financially in the world, he sent his sons to what then was called the land of infinite opportunity. And what was that called? America. So here he sent, the old man sent two of his sons, Adolf being one of them, to America in 1867, right after our, you got to kind of keep the U.S. history in mind. So 1867, right after our Civil War, they got off the boat like everybody else did in New York Harbor, and they moved on. Now, Adolf Lewison, our man here, he was not highly educated. He wasn't a doctor or an engineer or a scientist, but because of the family background, he understood business. And so he continued his father's business in America, but only on a moderate scale. The way the story goes is, along the way, in the late 1800s, somebody owed a debt to Mr. Lewison. They didn't have the cash to pay it off. And so the debtor decided that maybe I could trade Mr. Lewison to satisfy my debt. And the satisfying of the debt was land offered to Mr. Lewison, a lot of land, in Butte, Montana. Now, picture this now. This is in the late 1800s. Lewison probably had no idea where Montana was. Around Butte, Montana, but the deal came with the fact that it had a copper mine on the property. Now, Lewison he didn't know anything about copper, how to mine it, how to produce it, but he knew what the sense of America was all about. If you remember, can you remember, Bill, your fourth grade history book? And you went through the chapter on the Civil War. After the Civil War, the next chapter, you open the page, and here were two black locomotives head to head with a bunch of fancy dressed men in black top coats and black silk hats. What were they celebrating in Promontory Point, Utah?
Transcontinental Railroad.
Exactly. So Lewison knew railroads were the big thing. 1876, a young man showed off this fancy looking glass ball with a stem, and in it he put these curly wires and hooked the wires to this unknown thing called electricity. Thomas Edison was showing off his first light bulb, and he said someday everybody will have a light bulb in their home run by copper wires. Morse, earlier than that, invented the Morse code, copper wires along the railroad. Then a young man by the name of Alexander Graham Bell, this funny thing you put up to your ear, the telephone. So on and on, copper was a commodity, a big commodity. Everything I just mentioned ran on copper, or was produced with parts of copper. And so Lewison, he didn't know anything about the mining or the production. He knew where his market was, New York City. At that time, the financial capital of the world on. It was also, however, an industrial city still back then in the late 1800s. And with industry, New York City, turn of the century, everything, every machine, every power unit was operated by burning coal. So now you take summer in New York City. Hot, muggy. This isn't bad up here, is it, today? No. But in New York City right now, it would be probably in the 90s and probably 95% humidity. But then you throw coal dust in the air. And now you have respiratory diseases, Faith. Everything from emphysema to asthma, and the worst of them all back then, tuberculosis. So anybody with money would want to get out of the city in the summertime. And even to this day, many people do that. Hence all, who's watching one of my favorite new streaming series on TV, The Gilded Age? Anybody watching that? It's a good one, but it covers this period in history.
We watched Downton Abbey, which is
Downton Abbey was
Similar, but Downton Abbey is like not the prequel, that's the sequel to the Gilded. The Gilded Age was from the 1860s up until the turn of the century, but then, Downton Abbey, that's one of my favorites also. So, Lewison now, by the turn of the century, because of his copper industry, he was one of the wealthiest men in America. By the turn of the century, he went from a 17-year-old boy getting off the boat. 35 years later, he was worth $250 million. Back in 1900, Bill, when you say, my goodness, yes, you can do the math on that one. And so, as such, again, no matter how much money you had, New York was still New York in the summer. So the fashionable thing to do was to have a country home. Well, he had to have multiple. His main residence, if you know, who knows New York City at all, the grid work, okay. How many years did you live in Brooklyn?
21.
And what were you doing there? Ministering. Teaching street ministry, how to take people from little country churches perhaps up here, teach them how to do street ministries in the Bowery and on the streets of New York City. That's what they were doing.
I just want to tell where we were, the rich people that couldn't afford homes up out of the city would leave Manhattan Island and come to the area where we actually lived, Norton's Point.
In Brooklyn.
Yes.
So that was considered like to go out to the country for the...
Right.
Yep.
The DuPont mansion and other mansions were built there in that area where we lived.
In that part of it.
Now, if you have a little more money, you'd go to Newport, Rhode Island. But if you had the real money, now here's the big part of the story. And if you were Jewish, that was the problem. The anti-Semitism in the late 1800s, and of course going right up to the Second World War, the anti-Semitism was so strong, Jews couldn't go just anywhere they wanted. So Lewison knew that. And I'll tell you on the lake here, there are probably 6 or 8 of the wealthiest Jewish families from New York City. When one, and we'll see that camp, bought a piece of property here, and a large piece of property, one more Jewish family bought and bought and bought. And Lewison was one of them. Joe, when you get back to the Ausable Inn, in your main room there, the wall facing the lake, to the right-hand corner, there's a glass bookcase in there. And there's a book in there, and it's simply called Our Crowd. And the subtitle is The Story of the Wealthy Jewish Families of New York City. Everything I'm talking about can be found in that book in terms of the history of who these people were. So Lewison, his main residence was 881 Fifth Avenue, New York City. And as such, when he opened the front door of his house at 5th Avenue and 90th Street, what was he looking at, Tom?
5th Avenue?
And 90th Street.
And 90th Street, he was looking at maybe the Guggenheim Museum's up there. And
that was to his left or right. In front of him was the whole breadth of Central Park. My point is, when you talk, Bill, about location for real estate, you have the finest place in New York. And to be right there in the midst of Central Park, that was his playground. Yes, Maureen?
I ask a lot of questions as my girlfriends know. Okay, if the Jews could not go to certain neighborhoods for vacation homes, how could he live in the premier? How could a Jewish family?
No. In New York, the book is all about it. Our Crowd. New York was a broad, cosmopolitan city. Jews were not legally separated, socially separated. It's like they would not be invited to certain parties and the like. And so the Jews themselves, the title of that book, Our Crowd, that's their own term. We generally stick with our crowd back in the city, you see? And so when they came up here, what did they do? They all bought similar properties on the south end of this lake. So that's why Lewison built our property. He had a fabulous place on the Jersey Shore just for June and July. This was only for the month of August, and then in Westchester County, New York, in Ardsley on the Hudson, he had a gentleman's farm for no other reason to have all his greenhouses there, and he demanded fresh flowers every day of the year. whether he was here, New York City, or wherever. So his gardeners, fresh flowers. So that's who built this property. So it gives you a picture of the man. Now, why was this popular? You're only looking at one little bay of this lake. This is Upper Saranac Lake, one of the largest lakes in the Adirondacks. And south of here, north of here, you have about 7.5 miles from north to south. The widest point down below, about 2.5 miles wide. But the unique part of this, if you look right over Joe's hat right there, you would think, oh, we're going to crash into shore. That's an island right there. You can't even tell it from here. And so as such, between islands, bays like this is Healthy Bay, right? Hilton Bay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get
And
mixed
then
up.
Gull Bay is right
Gull Bay over there. So you have these gulls, you have the peninsulas, the islands. So everywhere you are, you feel like this is my private lake right here. That's why it's such, as a lake, is so desirable. Now, I can't show you now, but I can point to it. I can point to clouds. But up there are the what we call the high peaks of the Adirondacks. The Adirondack Park, of which you're in the middle of right now, is a 6 million acre park in quotes. It's not like Glacier National Park or Yellowstone National Park. It's a designation in the state of New York, bigger than the state of New Jersey, bigger than the state of Massachusetts, bigger than the state of Vermont. And if you go to Massachusetts, how many people live in the state of Massachusetts? I think it's something like 8.5 million people, which is reasonable, right? The Adirondacks, which is the same size as that state, there are only 130,000 people like my wife and I who live here. So even though this was developed over the years, this is very sparsely settled. And part of the reason is this so-called park, the Adirondack Park, as designated in 1892, half of the land today is owned by the state of New York. And there's a New York State clause in the Constitution that says all the state land, we're going to call it forest preserve, that land where we take hikers every year up to Ampersand Mountain, right, Joe? Only one cabin at a time, that's another story. Up there, that will be forever wild, never sold, no timber cut on it, no development. But the private land, Lewison could do whatever he wanted when his agents, that would be the term, his agents went out and found this property. Now, the property that we own from those sailboats and around our peninsula, that little chunk right, that's only about 40 acres. Across the highway, Route 30, we own about another 60, so 100 acres. When you buy property on this lake, it has nothing, the value has very little to do with acreage. New York City, it's how many curb feet you own in Manhattan. How many feet along the curb of a street, because that's the value. Here it's how many feet of shoreline you own. I'm on the board, you may not like me if you lived in my town, on the Board of Assessment Review. When you come in to grieve your taxes bill, you have me and 4 others.
He has done that in our county.
You know what I mean. So, but in our little town, not this right here, but about 15 miles away, we just had a total reassessment bill. And a brand new reassessment, you had to hire an outside firm. And for lakeshore value, because they first value the property and then the buildings upon it. Lakeshore property here was valued at $4,500 a foot. Yeah, so if you owned just 100 feet of shoreline on this lake, there's your first $500,000 assessment.
Whoa.
Okay, and I'll develop that story along the way. So the value to the Adirondacks is twofold. When Lewison built, he could do whatever he wanted. He had a mile of shoreline. Do the math on that. You see, there's at least a $50 million piece of property just for its value of shoreline, let alone the buildings on it. Now, here's the catch. Lewison could do whatever he wanted. Since 1973, the state of New York created what they call the Adirondack Park Agency. And they were charged with 2 things, Joe. First, to manage the public use of those state lands. And since they were established, when Joe used to take 350 kids en masse, climb Ampersand Mountain, hollering and screaming and having a good time, right? One year, Joe, you remember that, we took 350 up, we came back with 3 less. Now, thank God, 3 days later, we found those kids. But that just was like a red flag that went up to the use of the state lands. Now, you cannot take more than 15 people in a group. And not only for safety, but also for the fact that when you go up there with 350 kids, other people who want to have a wilderness experience, 350 kids don't add to that. So now we just take one cabin each week, or they have an alternate thing that they could pick out. So that gives you an idea. The second thing the Adirondack Park Agency was charged with is to take the other 3 million acres of privately owned and classify them as to their development potential, or development ability, however you want to say it. So every square acre, every acre in the Adirondacks, my point is, even if Young Life owned that multi-million-dollar piece of property, there was no way we ever could be allowed to build a 600-bed camp that we have today. So God has really blessed Young Life in that regard. We bought this in 1968, 5 years before the Adirondack Park Agency. But since we bought it, we are still under some of the grandfather laws as to how much you can develop. Lydia's going to taking us next to this island that I pointed out before. This is Deer Island. Now, Deer Island is very unique in that it's a large island. I think the entire island by 2 families. This first family, to which we're approaching, this was the old Van Voorhees family from 1916. They built what you're looking at now, Judge Van Voorhees from Rochester, New York. But this is truly the best example I can show you on this lake of a family-owned, generationally owned great camp in the Adirondacks. Now let me back up a bit. In the Adirondacks, when I say the word camp, it's a very generic term that applies basically, the best way, the definition of a seasonal recreational residence. It could be a multi-building estate like this for one family and their private guests. It could be an institutional camp property like ours, Young Life being the institution. It could be one little camp over here like that one there, and they might have, they might have 100 feet of shoreline on their lake just for one family that come seasonally. Now, when I said this is the best example I can show you of a great camp in the Adirondacks, that's an idea that started way back in the 1800s, in the 1870s really, by William West Durant, but that doesn't matter. But he created this idea of creating a wilderness property so that wealthy people could come and have a wilderness experience. But Bill, especially for Maureen, you would make sure not to give up any of the amenities that she was used to in her city environment. So that was the dichotomy and the challenge for the architects. So one thing they did, and you're going to see it here, multiple buildings, just like on our property, each, however, with a singular use. Don, you walked out of the Ausable Inn. You hopefully had a good night's sleep, folks, right? But you had to walk to a dining room to have your meal, then you walk out of that to the boathouse, then you walk out of that to the club room to be entertained. So the idea that the architects had was people had to but he could have lived right there. But to come up here, that was part of it. Now, the ladies of the time, Maureen, that came here were the upper crust of society and economic status. And so, God forbid, if a lady was walking out of her sleeping building to go over to dinner and to get her feet wet, walking through, no, that wasn't acceptable. So the covered walkways from building to building, and ours is just hold on a minute here. Our building was the ultimate, not only the covered walkways, and take note of this when you get back, the sliding glass panels. So Mr. Lewison if it was slightly inclement weather, a little too much wind, or a drizzle coming in, and the ladies didn't want to get their hair messed up on the way to dinner, those sliding glass panels would be closed. Just we're going to respect their privacy here. But this family, over the years, here's the story. When the old man dies and his estate gets passed on to his heirs, the estate is split up. When they die, the heirs normal. Okay, so unless new fortune is being made, the original owner, compared to 5 generations later, maybe they can't afford to keep the property. So this family did a wise thing, business-wise. They created a family corporation. I worked for part of their holdings at one time, and the check would come back, Deer Island Corporation. And so even if young people like your son married into the family, that didn't give him use of Deer Island. He had to buy in to the corporation, yearly dues, a board of directors, but that is the most beautifully maintained. You see the covered walkways right there from the main lodge over to the sleeping cabin, another walkway over to the boathouse. The first boathouse, that's sort of their utility boathouse, and you saw the stern end of a wooden boat. That's called the To and Fro. Beautiful. It's probably one of the largest and oldest wooden boats on this lake. That's their family taxi cab back and forth. And so even though island living is very secluded, very private, very romantic, still it has its challenges, because every bag of groceries, every workman back and forth across the lake. But that's how that one family has maintained that. This property over here is called Bull Point. The original owner was another German Jew by the name of Otto Kahn, K-A-H-N. The only remnant of the original camp that I can show you is the boathouse. A little different than ours. It has those white stucco panels on the second floor. And by the way, there's bedrooms up there. New construction, you cannot have a bedroom and toilets like some of the ladies used in our boathouse. That's over with. New construction, you can't, for fear that a pipe should break and any contamination to this lake. Back then, fewer people on the lake, because there are probably 600 camps on this lake, and we're the biggest by far. So those rules are different. But just the trademark of the German community was to have flower boxes with red geraniums. If you see that on the lake, you know it's old German money. They carry on the tradition. And something about back in Germany, and I don't know this, so you might know more than I do, something about the geraniums, a window box would keep the insects out. They don't like coming to it. Before they had screens on the windows. But Otto Kahn, let me tell you a little bit about him, a German Jew. And he came to America and he made his fortune on Wall Street. Anybody who built the place up here was amazingly wealthy at the time. This is that gilded age. No rules, no income tax, no securities commission and this and that. They could do what they want. Now, it's not so much money that they had, but the influence that they had in society at the time. Otto Kahn right here, for a number of years, he was chairman of the board of the Metropolitan Opera. You've heard of that? And he was very influential, even to the point where he brought from Italy the most famous tenor that ever sang at the Metropolitan Opera, Enrico Caruso. Have you ever heard that name?
Yeah.
Now, if Caruso, Bill, is going to sing, you have to have a fine orchestra and a leader. Toscanini was the orchestra leader. So here's the man who brought that to America. Now, he was chairman of the board of the Metropolitan Opera. And I think I could give you an exact quote from him as he addressed the board, starting with gentlemen. Don, you and I might be part of that, but women were no part of boards of directors back then, Maureen, you see. And so as such, he said, gentlemen, I am not prejudiced against Jews, for I am one myself, as if they didn't know already. He said, however, I have a strong recommendation, and that is that I recommend that we sell no more than 3 opera booths to Jews for the success of this enterprise. Because then the Gentiles, what's a Gentile?
Well, it's not Jewish.
Yeah, anybody who's not Jewish is a Gentile. That the Gentiles would not see the social interaction. It's not that the Jews were restricted, but if too many Jews, the Gentiles would say, no, I'm not going there.
Right.
That's how bad the has it gotten any better today? I don't know. But you know, with the riots we had over this,
Gaza.
all that, right. So that is right at Columbia University even. I can tell you stories all day about that. But that was the tone of things right there. But to give you the idea, when they came to the Adirondacks, by the way, that boathouse is the only lasting vestige of the original property. The main lodge behind it, those are all gone. These little cottages, their grandchildren keep building over the years, just simple little cottages to spend the summer.
Did the lodge just fall into disrepair? The
Yeah,
original lodge?
that was
Didn't
just
burn
gone,
down
yep.
or anything.
By the way, it was beautiful. The architect who designed this, William Coulter, the architectural critics even said this was Coulter's finest work. Our property was a fine work, but it was also the very biggest project he ever had. We had,
So Coulter did ours too?
yes, same ours was 40 buildings at the time, and on and on. But that right there, if you look back to the right-hand side of the boathouse, see where that yellow little boat is? There's a little dock there falling into the lake. I could show you on a calm day, I could take you out there, Tom, and show you the foundation of the original dock, which was probably at least, if not bigger than the whole boathouse itself. So, remember who Mr. Kahn is. And what did they do? They came for the whole summer up here. Now, the view is pretty, the lake was wonderful, but after a while, even that gets, what do you do all summer?
Music.
You entertain. And music, right? And when you entertain, the key was who is invited, who is not invited. See, there's that social structure, Maureen. But if you were fortunate enough to have Mr. Kahn invite you, that big dock I just talked about that once was there, if he was having a party with the snap of a finger, he would summon a full orchestra to come up from New York City by train, 11-hour train trip, Tupper Lake, and then by stagecoach to this lake. And when you were greeted, you would have a full orchestra entertaining you, Kim, just as guests of Mr. Kahn. So that was the life. See what I mean? It's the wilderness. There were no roads here yet. And yet, only by train, stagecoach, and the lake, you would arrive and you were entertained as if you were right in New York City with a fine orchestra.
The sound of that orchestra going across this water must have
that had to be
been
amazing.
Especially on a nice calm day like this. Where's my Downton Abbey fans here? Okay, Downton Abbey. You see that boathouse right there? Now that's a big boathouse. In the fact that it's 60 feet from the shore out into the water. Now if you know anything about boats, Joe, as you do, 14 feet of depth of water at the end of that boathouse. That's one of the deep, that could take any of the biggest boats on this lake. But look how plain and simple it is, and it's also part of this boathouse here with the flowers, and it was much more elaborate at the time. Downton Abbey, that's the servants' entrance. This is the guest entrance. And what you can't tell is that rock outcropping that we just passed, you cannot even see from one boathouse to the other. By chance, no. The architect, that was the society of the day. The servants that were not seen by the guests unless they were served a cocktail or a meal. So that lifestyle, so the architects had to create that here. And when the guests left New York City, with them came their servants, which came the linen, the crystal, the silver, and all that it took to entertain in the highest of style, whether it be Newport, Rhode Island, or Upper Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks. Now, the working class Jews, if they had a little money, they would go to the Catskills. Did you ever hear of the Borscht Belt?
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
that's where the old, I love them, the old Jewish comedians, that's where they got their start. Fleshman's, Grossinger's, Lake Kiamisha, all the big Jewish hotels in the Catskills. But the wealthiest of them came up here. These boathouses in front of us, I could fool you, and they might look at it like well-kept 100-year-old boathouses. They're not. The first boathouse on my right, that was built about 25 years ago. The one in the middle is only about 10 years old. The one to the far left is only about 8 years old. If you notice the first two on the right, there's a little bit similar in color and style,
Right.
which would tell you that they're part of the same camp. Because as you saw on Deer Island, and even our property, same color scheme, same architectural style. A new friend of ours on the lake in the last 30 years or so, Jerry Hacker, managed to buy a good chunk of shoreline right here. Fairly wealthy. He'd build you luxury homes in Southern California. He ran military cybersecurity firms up and down for the military, the East Coast. He just knows how to make money. And a nice friend of ours. And when he bought here, there was nothing. It was just vacant land, open land. So he was determined to stay on this property his first summer, at least for a while. But he had no place to live. Back then, so at least 30 years ago, I just knew the date of it. Who remembers the movie Dances with Wolves with Kevin Costner?
Yeah,
With all the Plains Indian teepees?
Yeah.
So Bill, he had the same company that built the movie set, the Plains Indian teepees, and he had them build one for him. And we might see just a little of it through the trees to the right of the boathouse. Last known, he hasn't put the skin on the poles. Let's see, am I seeing it yet? Yeah. Yeah, Lydia's seeing it in there. Just keep looking. There it is. I can see it.
Oh, yeah.
So that's Jerry's first residence, the first year, and he usually puts the skin on for his, covering the poles there. We haven't seen him yet this summer. He's getting older. Look at the disrepair. That one piece coming out of the boathouse right there. I'm not quite sure.
Oh, yeah.
But he did a good job building these boats. He has a fabulous
Yeah, they're
collection
gorgeous.
of boats in there that I'd love to show you.
The stone.
One day, I knew that he also, I don't know how he pulled this off, north end of the lake, Tom, he bought an entire small island. And I'm always involved with construction guys in town, and I knew they were building him another little camp on that island. So I said to him, well, Jerry, why are you building another property when you have this? He said, well, sometimes a few too many relatives show up, and I need a little getaway over there. So
I'll be back.
I'll be back. So one day I'm on this boat and we're giving the boat tour up that way. We had more time back then up on the north end of the lake. And so we stop at Dry Island to see, 'cause I wanted to see his new camp being built there. Very, very modest, but really well done. And you barely can see it, very much concealed by trees and all. You can just see little tiny views of it, and one little boathouse with just one slip for a boat to go in. But who pulls up while I'm giving a lecture there, Bill? But Jerry Hacker. I said, Jerry, what's going on here? I hear you got your camp finished up here. I hope you're pleased with it. And as I'm talking, you see that beach right there? He has like a little beach like that, and down the stairs and onto the beach. Excuse my language, ladies. 3 or 4 good-looking dames are coming down, young and pretty, with white terry cloth bathrobes on. I look a little closer, Joe. You know.
I turned
And
my head. You
but
never
then
went
I
the
look
other
a
way.
little closer, Joe, and here along the shore, all the photographers and their light panels and all that. I said, Jerry, what's all the activity here? He said, well, I'm not going to be using this island all the time. I might rent it out now and then. I need a little free publicity. Sports Illustrated magazine, Joe, is doing their swimsuit.
God.
So that's how money keeps making money and keeps building.
But what year and month was that?
Our camp, when we left our camp and you look back at our boathouse, that is as original as any building on our property. Primarily, we haven't had to alter it, and you understand this kind of stuff, to house kids there. If you house kids in that building, then you have to have fire escapes and this and that. Since we don't house kids, that building, our boathouse, is almost original. Joe, take your guess when you get into the office and go into Drew's office. Tell him I sent you. If he's
Okay.
not there, just go in
Yep.
anyway. And there's a painting on the wall. And you look at it and you'll say, oh, there's our boathouse. And a big 30-foot long boat sitting right in front of it. I'll tell you what that boat is. And you look at it and say, yeah, that's our boathouse. And look at it's the artist rendering from 1901.
Oh, man.
Just an artist conception of what that boathouse might be like
Wow.
someday, Kim. And if you look at the painting, look at our boathouse, it's almost identical. That's why I mean that has not changed.
Wow.
This boathouse here is part of another different property. This boathouse, again, it looks old by design. The materials look old by design. This boathouse, not so much, but also the camp, the new camp that was built, you know, some see staff out there with a duster cleaning up and all that. The only reason, folks, that our property is able to stay in existence is not because people are giving us $1 million a year to help maintain it. It's that work crew and summer staff, the people, the kids that served you breakfast this morning, and the kids that clean your room and make sure the public, with all the volunteers in Young Life, that person right there is probably getting paid $40 an hour. That's what it's paid for housekeepers on this lake. We have housekeepers, we have boat keepers, we have dishwashers, all being paid virtually nothing. That's how we're able, but it's because of the dedication of those young people who have embraced Young Life as a Christian belief system, but also as a ministry. I talked to Tom and Faith here, and the most amazing thing about Young Life was in that dining room this morning, Tom. When you saw those probably, I can't remember how many it was, like 21 high school kids walking out like this, serving other high school kids. That's where Young Life makes its mark, where that unity, that relational ministry is so important to us. Back to this boathouse, and Lydia's going to pull out, and you'll see the camp that was built as part of it. The property goes way back to one of the first hotels built on this lake right here, the Wabeek Hotel. That boathouse and the camp that goes with it, that boathouse, and I have the issue of Architectural Digest magazine. If you go to your doctor's office, Kim, and the coffee table, always Architectural Digest, magazine. That made the front cover, the story about this being built. And that was built, about 15 years ago. Now, the old hotel that used to be here, I'll show you that in a minute, but there was an outbuilding, then called the Wabeek Hotel. It's a long history, but that went into disrepair, and finally, this property was up for sale about 15 years ago. A couple.
Just real quick, when I was a boat driver in '76, we would have to go here to fill up the boats with gas.
Yep.
We didn't have gas capability at Saranac, but we loved it because we could just run the boats, drive all over the place, but we'd have to pull up and fill up with gas and then go back.
That's amazing. So in those days, you see, that was the Wabeek right up there. That outbuilding right there, was a couple, and they were from Malibu, California, came to visit this lake. Now, Malibu, California has dollar signs in front and behind it, right? And as such, they came here and they probably stayed at an exclusive resort up the lake called The Point. You can look that up on the internet. Even the latest magazine report was that The Point is probably one of the finest small country resorts in America, catering to CEOs, business executives to mingle and get to know each other. It's too small for the entertainers don't like it because they like the paparazzi to be chasing them around, for all that. But look at that building. All you can see that little glass structure at the top? Now, if you're from New England, what would that be called? A widow's walk. On the coast of Maine, right, Bill?
Yep.
And the women would be in there watching and hoping that their husbands come back from sea. That right there is a typical Adirondack structure, by the way. It's called a light shaft for a big, great room building with a big cathedral ceiling. So their great room in that building is there with that shaft bringing natural light down to it. So I can show you the article, but the details of that building are tremendous. And notice we can't see much of the building. I can show you also a picture of our property in 1903 as it was being constructed. When we go back, look at the boathouse and all the trees on the side hill of the peninsula. There was not one tree on that whole side of the peninsula. Part of it was the ease of construction to clear the site, build the buildings, West Lodge, Main Lodge, Dining Hall, East Lodge. But also there was a concept back then, and to this day it still exists, called conspicuous consumption. Certain people like to show off how much money they have. Lewison was one of them. Now, was that because of his ego? Yes, but also because of business. If you were a guest of Mr. Lewison's, and you were pretty prominent yourself, and you came there and you saw these 40 buildings, probably no less than 80 servants on the property for only 30 guests, there's a man to be reckoned with in a business deal. To be able to spend money beyond any idea of comfortable means. So that idea of conspicuous consumption was very popular at the time, to show off how much money you had. The guy who bought this, Dick Sittig, his name is. Anybody heard that name? You know what he's famous for, though I know you do. You watch television, once in a while a commercial, and there's this little bunny running around selling. So he's the advertising executive. He created the Energizer Bunny. He's the voice of Jack in the Box fast food around the country. So where Lewison was making millions in copper 100 years ago, Dick Sittig is making money in advertising. So that's where some of this money comes from. These buildings right here now, that one right there in particular, that's a year-round home. I didn't call it a camp, you see? And because it's year-round living and it was built, and the reason it's year-round, because they have a paved road, not much of one, but a paved road right behind it, not like the island. That's definitely a camp. And these right here were subdivided properties from, now if you look right behind Lydia over here, a little dip in the trees there, that's where, if I can find it, that's where the original Waubee Hotel used to stand. Now if you look at this picture, and there's a little bit of a dock spot right there. There was a boathouse, look at all that, pass that around. So you can imagine the size of that hotel, and there's one other called Saranac Inn at the north end of the lake. So there were only 2 road accesses to this lake when Lewison built. One at Waubee, which would be accessed from Tupper Lake, one at Saranac Inn, which would be accessed through Saranac Lake, Tupper Lake and Saranac Lake. So when our camp was built, no roads, every bit of machinery, material, manpower had to come across this lake. And it wasn't always on a barge. In the dead of winter, solid ice on this lake, a heavy team of horses and big wagons would be dragged across this lake to build our property. Look at that little dock right behind you, Bill. Turn to your right if you would. See that dock right there sticking out into the water? It doesn't look like much, but look, as we go by, just look behind it, a little dirt road in there that goes off to the left. If I take you back now to 1892, there was a prominent physician in this country. His name was Dr. William Seward Webb. And Tom, as you are, Joe, you are, Bill, you are, Don, you are, and I am, we're fortunate men. And we're fortunate because we married well. We married well. And this Dr. William Seward Webb married very well. He married Lila Vanderbilt. You might know Lila's brother, George Washington Vanderbilt. What did he build in North Carolina near Asheville? The Biltmore Estate. If you've ever visited that, to this day, America's largest single-family home with 238 rooms. My wife and I have visited many, many times, including at Christmas. So Vanderbilt, not the Vanderbilt, Dr. Webb, they thought, you know, the Vanderbilt family thought it quite quaint and respectable to be a physician helping people, but not up to the Vanderbilt's history of knowing how to make money. Where do you make money back then? Railroads. So in 1892, Dr. Webb was encouraged to build the first railroad from south of the Adirondacks in Utica, New York, 100 and, how far is it? I think it's 140 some odd miles through a vast wilderness all the way to the Canadian border. They had an ulterior motive because the Vanderbilts bought about a 20,000 acre piece of property in the heart of the Adirondacks, and they wanted easy access. So the railroad came right through their property. They had their own railroad station, but only Vanderbilts would get on the train or off the train at Vanderbilt Station. Lake Lila is the name of the camp. That road right there in 1892 that I talked about right behind that dock, that goes 7 miles. Joe, you and I could take a walk today. And where would it lead us? To Tupper Lake, to the old train station that was rebuilt, and that's a big thing now. And so in 1892, and I actually in my notes I have, or articles I picked up, Tom, I have an actual train schedule in 1892. You could get on a train in New York City, Grand Central Station. I pick on Tom and Faith because they know the city. You can get on a train at about 6:30 in the evening at Grand Central, the New York Central, and the New York Central will bring you up through the Hudson Valley. By the time you get to Poughkeepsie or Hyde Park, you're having a beautiful gourmet meal in the dining car, and then you would retreat to the sleeping car and have a nice night's sleep, and then you start chugging up through the Adirondack Mountains. 11 hours later, at 7 in the morning, pretty much, you wind up in Tupper Lake. Full. It's not like the airlines nowadays, especially with the cyber problem. People waiting almost a week now in airports, living in airports. That's another story. You don't need to know the news now. But my point is, they were able to get here then by 1892 by train to Tupper Lake. Now, if you got off the train, Kim, there was no Hertz Rent-A-Car. So next to the railroad station, there would be a row of stagecoaches, each with gold lettering, leaf lettering, advertising and vying for your business for their hotel. One of those stagecoaches would say the Wabi Hotel. So you'd get off the stagecoach, 7 miles, and you'd wind up right at that dock I pointed out, Don. Now, if you look back in the picture I showed you, not a very far walk over to your Wabi Hotel. But if you weren't going to the Wabi Hotel, and you would know that, there was, now, go back, Joe, to the painting you're going to show everybody in Drew's office. There's a boat this size, not a parasail boat. Where Lydia is, this is a steam engine, and back there is a pile of firewood. It was a steam launch with a beautiful canopy on top, you know, with the frills around it, the canvas canopy. And that was just like a city bus. If you wound off, came off the stagecoach here, Don, you'd pay your fare, you and your wife would get on the stagecoach and you would come here. Now, if you weren't going to the Wabi, and one time Adolph Lewison wasn't, he would have to get on that boat, and I have a map of all 35 miles, like a city bus. It would drop you off at various points along the lake, and that was the first form of transportation. So that's how it all started. Before that time, let's go around. Yep. By the way, this boathouse here, if it looks familiar to you, it should. Joe, really turn your head and look at Deer Island. If you own Deer Island and that boathouse we had there, you have to have another boathouse on the mainland. There, they own half that whole island. Here, I know for a fact they only own 60 feet of shoreline. They don't need the space here. If you look at that right there, see that big deck coming off the backside on the second floor? Okay. Over there, people were enjoying themselves on the second floor of their family boathouse. That boathouse right there, that heavy deck off the back end leads to that dirt road I just talked about, and you can drive into that, and that second floor of the boathouse is a 5-car garage. And so when you arrive in your BMW from Philadelphia on a kind of a chilly, rainy Friday night, pull into the boathouse upstairs, walk down the staircase, and you notice the far right slip is a little bit bigger. That's where the to and fro from the island would be picking you up. What I didn't tell you about the to and fro, it's old, beautiful, wooden. It's all a beautiful wooden canopy over the bow of the boat, all glass enclosed. So even to this day, you would go over to your other boathouse after getting out of your BMW, and you walk into your boathouse across a covered walkway into the dining room, and perhaps tonight we'll have roast leg of lamb that the chef had prepared. So that lifestyle is still very much alive on this lake.
Wow.
And the key is, I saw that camp on Deer Island, and I think the ownership could have changed. they had that island, half of that island, and that beautiful camp I just showed you for sale for under $4 million. Now I say only, that doesn't sound like much, but do you have the money to maintain it, to staff it, to bring it up to that, and the taxes? And I can go on and on. So the price of some of these old properties, I can show you a brand new, tiny little place with 60 feet of shoreline for $4 million. But it's up to modern standards. You can get to it, drive to it. You can come from Malibu, California, your private jet, you're 4 miles away at the Adirondack Airport, have a car pick you up, and you're from Malibu, you have your own place on this lake worth $4 million, but you don't have the expense and everything. Or we met a couple that stayed at this The Point Resort. That was the old William Avery Rockefeller estate on the north end of the lake. Now, listen to this. Rockefeller, there's nothing about him that's Jewish. So the Jews were only socially welcome on the south end of the lake, starting with this man right here, Joseph Seligman. This property here, you see some old buildings, you see some new buildings. This was the estate for Joseph Seligman. He was the first to build here. And he was a man that came to America. Who has seen my favorite Broadway play? Faith, did you see Fiddler on the Roof?
Yeah.
You're familiar with that. That was the pogroms, the scattering of the Jewish people in Russia and Eastern Europe. Nobody wanted the Jews. They were scattered, all the diaspora, is that the term? The diaspora, where the Jews are scattered throughout the world. And so Seligman saw the handwriting on the wall, and he left way earlier than Adolf Lewison did. Seligman left before the Civil War in the 1840s, and he had no money, but he had one skill from back home. He could put a pack basket on his back, load it up with household goods, and walk village to village, home to home, farm to farm. He was a peddler. Now, this is before the Civil War. He got so, if we could just wait 1 minute here. My timekeeper, I always have to beg her, can I have another minute? Which is good, she keeps us honest. So Seligman, though, he was so good at it that he was down the southeast coast, and he got into the textile business, because down there, wool, cotton, and the like. So he was producing everything from blankets to clothing. The Civil War broke out, and that's where he became a millionaire. And as he became a millionaire, he kept moving a little farther north. And along the way, I keep wanting to say Ruth, Faith. Along the way, Seligman moved north and he got married. And from Fiddler on the Roof, he married a Jewish woman. There were no mixed marriages back then.
Seligman was not a Jew.
No, Seligman was. And so there were no mixed marriages. So when he got married, he married a Jewish lady. She must have had a different background than Joseph, because along the way, he's already a millionaire, and he gets married, and they wind up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And here's a quote from Mrs. Seligman. And she turns to her husband, Joseph, and says, "Joseph, the city of Philadelphia is not up to my social standards. You will move us to New York City." And what was Joseph's response, Bill? Yes, dear. Remember that part. We all know that. The answer is yes, dear. The answer is yes, dear. But fortuitous for Joseph, he winds up on Wall Street, and he became one of the most influential, wealthy, and popular private bankers on Wall Street. Now, admittedly, these Jewish families, these kids that came over from Europe, they, when they got to America, they had only lived with a kosher diet, right? And so with that kosher diet, when they got off the boat, or even before they got off the boat, and the smell of Italian food from Mott Street was, that sounds good, some good pork sausage, you know what I mean? And Lewis himself, he said, I want to become a good citizen of America and all the American ways. And so as the years went on, they were kids, Kim, when they came to America. Could you imagine a 17-year-old kid, you raise them as a kosher Jew, you send them to New York City, synagogue and all, always belonged to a synagogue, but they got less and less religious as the years went on. But they never forgot their innate values as a Jew: philanthropy, family, just that whole idea, and the religious beliefs that they had. They weren't active. They only belonged to a synagogue and supported it financially, but that's how they were. Christians, you can say the same thing, right? So Seligman, he was also very patriotic. And in 1903, 1905, the country, and I read this exact report, he was so patriotic that he did not want to see, you're a diplomat in a sense, the government of America falter. So he decided his company, the House of Seligman on Wall Street, was going to underwrite the entire salary for the U.S. Navy 2 years running. And that was his contribution. Now, underwrite means if they fall short, we'll make up. I think you're smarter than I am, Bill, as a businessman, perhaps.
No.
That's what underwriting means, that you just guarantee a successful outcome.
Right.
So he was patriotic, he was wealthy, and he was willing to give money away. But he was a businessman also. He happened to have a little project going on. And he needed the military security and support of the United States Navy for his project. He also needed the votes of the politicians in Washington, D.C. He was looking pretty good, supporting the U.S. Navy. He was building the Panama Canal at the time. So see, here we've already gone from Lewisohn, I'll tell you more about him, to the Metropolitan Opera, to the Panama Canal. It was all happening on this lake.
Wow.
So it's not just the money they had, it's who these people were, and on and on. Joseph Seligman, he was one of the earliest in 1876, New York City, wanted to take his family out of the city for the summer. Got on the train. Oh, by the way, when I mentioned the Vanderbilts, what was their claim to fame financially? They owned the New York Central Railroad. So, but before that, Seligman wanted to get the family out. So he put them on a train and started going north. That's where you'd go to get away from the heat, try to move up a little in elevation. And the farthest north you could get was Saratoga Springs, New York. And in Saratoga Springs, they still have, since the Civil War, since the Civil War still, thoroughbred horse racing there. Did you see the movie Seabiscuit with Tobey Maguire? Some of those scenes were actually filmed recently at Saratoga Springs Racecourse. Okay, but Seligman brings his whole family on a train, and of course the biggest hotel, the fanciest, is where he wanted to stay. He had the money for it. It's called the Grand Union Hotel. I've seen a picture of that hotel. Focus in on the front door, and then right next to the front door, Kim, there's a very simple sign, and it simply said, anyone of Hebrew heritage need not apply at this hotel. So here, one of the wealthiest men in America, yet to build, he was still 25 years till he'd helped build the Panama Canal. His family was not allowed a suite of rooms at the Grand Union Hotel.
No
So
kidding.
but he had money. He was probably one of the first to fight in Washington for equal rights. But we're still fighting that same battle. Lewisohn, if you go to New York City today, 1915, he already owned our property. Lewisohn built for the city, the people of the city of New York, a 10,000 seat open air amphitheater, looked like something like the Greek Parthenon, for the common people of New York City to be entertained with the ballet that he loved, the opera he loved to hear, and George Gershwin debuted Rhapsody in Blue at Lewisohn Stadium. By the way, Chapel Island. There we go. This is Chapel Island.
you were talking about
and
this.
What you're looking at, that's Island Chapel. Just the reverse. The property is Chapel Island. The church is Island Chapel. That in 1885, the first group of Gentiles that were also Christians, because of the difference of how Gentiles are not Jews, but amongst the Gentiles, a certain group are Christians. They built the first church on this island. We have a beautiful picture of it inside the church, and this church. World War II, 1956. I still can remember. That was the first year Ed Sullivan show. Elvis Presley appeared on the Ed Sullivan show. So that's how old I am. You're starting producing now. I'll be 75 in a month. But luckily, when that church burned down, and it was just people, Christians on this shoreline supported it, and the war was over, the depression was over, they put their money, their effort, and they built a second building there. To this day, every Sunday, on July and August, we have the non-denominational church service there. On the next service, our pastor, Pastor Bruce, is maybe that's the but they have there's a road out here that connects with Route 3, Staten Island. And you can be picked up by a boat. That boat you're going to see in a moment. If you have a boat like this, you notice the way the trees are tipped here? The windward side of the island, the leeward side, that's where the dock always is. No waves here. So this boat, maybe would bring us to the dock, unload all the passengers, she would drop her anchor, and a young fellow in the 13-foot Boston Whaler would come to Lydia and take her to church also. So if you're wealthy enough and the fortunate enough to have a boat on this day, you can come by boat to church, right up those steps. I just helped the other week and put that long dock in. That's a temporary one, seasonal. So the water level is way high. This is the highest I've seen this lake with the rain we've had. Yep. But that is iconic to take a boat, go to church, and they have, somebody has to have their name on the deed of the property as the Northern New York Presbytery. But it's not a Presbyterian church, but it's non-denominational. So I even have a renegade good Catholic priest friend of mine. I don't know how he gets permission from the bishop, but he'll come out here once a year and preach. He doesn't do a full Catholic mass. There are rules in the Catholic Church, of which I am lifelong, but I go to two churches every Sunday. I do my Catholic church, and I join my wife at a good old-fashioned good Bible church in town. So I hedge my bet, Joe, in case one of them gets it wrong.
Gotcha.
So,
We have some folks that definitely are Catholic. That's part of our group, for
yep.
sure. So
Very good. I think next week we even have a Catholic priest come in, join as an adult guest.
Really?
I don't know where he's from. I don't have that information, but yeah, one year we came here, and even though Young Life also is non-denominational, we had a whole group of Catholic kids come up from Catholic schools. That the best thing I ever heard as a Catholic is we had these retreats up in Plattsburgh, New York, and everybody loved Father Bernie Kellogg, a good old-fashioned Irish priest. Even my wife, she's not talking about that kind of priest. So he gave these retreats, and they were just kind of spiritual retreats, but they were also for recovering alcoholics in a spiritual sense, and he was one himself. And my wife and I were there, and I never thought I'd ever hear a Catholic priest say this. He said, folks, to a group of about 30 people, I've been a Catholic priest for 41 years. I've been a Christian for the last 9 years. And it coincided when he quit drinking. And he almost died, and the bishop came to his hospital bed, on his deathbed, burning. I love you so much, I will do anything I can to help you. So that's what Young Life is on too. Our camp, Adolf Lewison, God blessed him, for 35 years. He built it in 1903. He died right on our property in 1938. God blessed him. But when he built our camp, he turned to his family, to their consternation, and said, family, I'm worth $250 million, remember. I am done making money. I'm going to start giving it away and spending it. And ladies, he went on a spending spree, traveling the world with an entourage of groupies. He was not educated. He never wanted to be looked upon as a fool. Those are his words. So if he was in Paris, as the Olympics are getting started this week, and he wanted to order the finest thing on a French menu, he would have his speech coach with him to know how to say that in French. At age 80, Bill, I'm only 5 years away, he thought it great exercise for a gentleman of his stature to take up tap dancing. So as he traveled the world, his dance coach would travel with him. He always had a private secretary, a man, with a stenographer to record every word he said. But over the years, I've never read anything about Adolf Lewison referring to his wife. I think it was just a marriage of convenience. It looked good to be married, to have children, to pass on the legacy. I talked about Lewison Stadium, what he built in New York City. I had a friend just get their doctorate degree at Columbia University. Now, right away, I knew Columbia and City College of New York are side by side. He built the stadium at City College of New York, City University of New York now. But Columbia University, he gave money for the first school of mining at Columbia University. His own son went to Columbia University, and he wanted to join a fraternity. He was banned from the fraternity because he was a Jew. And Lewison just created a whole... Lewison, no. It's a good cause. I'm still giving money, even though his own son. So these were the Jews that were trying to break that cycle of our crowd, that the Jews could only stick with the Jews. So these were far-reaching people. Faith, if you look to this island over here, this is, wait a minute, I gotta get my bearings straight. Where are we? Dead ahead, that island with those sailboats. So, now over here, Deer Island, over here. Deer Island was built by Mr. Lewison's neighbor, and he completed his project 2 years before Lewison did. Happened to be a man by the name of, oh gosh, I'm getting too old for this one. I'm too old. Levi Parsons Morton, who happened to be the Vice President of the United States under Benjamin Harrison in the 1880s. By then, Bill, he was now no longer Vice President. He was a diplomat, federal diplomat. I don't know the exact. He was also governor of New York State at the time. So he built his. There, over here. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm that island right there.
Do we call it Girl Scout Island?
Yeah, Girl Scout Island
Girl
or
Scout.
Eagle Island.
Yeah, Eagle Island,
So,
that's right.
to make a long story short, a guy like you in the diplomatic corps, you maybe know him. So he was governor, he was vice president, he was this and that. But finally he had a diplomatic job. And one of his jobs was, all of a sudden, the country of France wanted to give America a little gift. And this guy right here, Morton, was in charge of seeing to how that gift would be displayed in America, and it happened to be the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. Now we're going to the next door neighbor who's responsible for the Statue of Liberty. So this was quite a mighty thing back then. So Lewison, and I think you heard some of this story through Joe, when he died in 1938, he was only worth, remember, $250 million when he bought our place, built our place. When he died, he only had $1.5 million. But imagine our Fifth Avenue, the Jersey Shore, place in Westchester, and his family, when they inherited all the properties, they didn't want anything to do with this. They called it this shack in the woods. And so they sold it. They sold the whole place for $40,000. He paid 35 years earlier $2.5 million to build this in 1903. Well, who bought it? Joe's going to show you the piece of the book. The interaction of all these Jewish families, both in business and in marriage. The Seligman family, they already had a camp. But one of the Lewison boys was married to a Seligman girl. So it's pretty much bought the property from the Seligman family. She had a vision, she was Jewish, to teach, now we go to younger girls. She wanted to teach young girls in America, Jewish as they are, that they could become anything they chose to be in America. They were into women's rights, I don't want to say feminism, but the rights of women, that they could do what they wish to do. We may say, she said, one of these days, one of you young girls might even be a justice of the Supreme Court as a Jew. I think we just had one retire. Yep. You see?
Yep.
And that was her mission. Now, it was mostly Jewish girls because her job professionally, she was a professional fundraiser for Jewish philanthropies, like Lewison, Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, the pathology laboratory building has his name on it. So he gave money away, and these Jewish people did. The reason you don't know the name Lewison is because when he died, the money was gone. He spent it and gave it away already. There was no Ford Foundation or Rockefeller Plaza, you know, with his name on it. That's why it's an obscure name. But in his day, he did a lot of good. One last story. I'm in that captain's table, right where you had breakfast, Faith, and it was lunchtime, and I'm looking over at our fireplace. By the way, there were at one time 40 separate fireplaces in every place on the property where a guest would be. I'm looking up from my lunch table, and there are, my wife hates when I characterize. Here are these two little old Jewish ladies standing by the fireplace. I grew up in New Jersey, right outside of New York City. Growing up, everything was ethnicity, religion. My mother would say to you, when you, oh, what are you? What are you? And you couldn't say, well, I'm American, or I'm this. No, what? No. Where are your people from? She would say. Where are you? So these two little Jewish ladies. So I approached them. They were old, and they started looking around and saying they were here when this camp from 1952, when it was called Camp Navarack. We were campers here before Young Life bought it. And they started telling me the story of their experience. Now, they wouldn't spend a week here, they would spend 7 weeks, the entire summer. Sarah Blum would charter, back then in 1952, a train, private train, start out in South Carolina, and the cities along the way where she had contact with Jewish families would pick up these young girls. Okay? Richmond, Virginia, Newport News, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City. When she got to Plattsburgh, New York, 50 miles away, there would be buses waiting to bring the 109 girls to camp to stay for 7 weeks. It didn't take those two ladies 5 minutes, and there were tears coming down my face. They were in tears, telling me the wonderful, wonderful experience they had here as girls. And one of them said, I came here every year. I started when I was in 2nd grade, and I came every summer till I graduated high school. 10 years running. And it was the most, she loved it. And by the end of, and they knew that Young Life, a Christian organization, owned it now, and yet they were Jewish girls here just a decade earlier. And they believed, and this was their words, not mine, they said, Paul, this property is holy ground. And they said that in a general way, and they just loved seeing, not in a religious sense, but again, what we are doing with young people. And teaching them good values, but also, in our case, leading them to a Christian belief. And they were just wonderful. I don't see, good. There's nobody wanting to parasail right now. So
Paul, quick question. What famous guests have stayed here on this property?
Oh gosh, now look, if you were Mr. Lewison and you were, I don't know, was Bell Telephone the CEO of Bell Telephone, you would pay a call on Mr. Lewison. When President Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, 1926, his summer White House was right near where I live, about 15 miles from here, and of course the president would be one of Mr. Lewison's guests. Who wrote Tom Sawyer? And
Mark Twain. Mark
Huh?
Twain.
Mark Twain.
Yeah, Mark Twain.
He spent time. He was Jewish. He spent time on Lower Saranac Lake, but if he was in the neighborhood, I would have to guarantee that he would spend time to pay a call.
I think
on
maybe
Mr.
Albert
Lewis.
Einstein.
Einstein also. He was Lower Saranac. Good history, Joe. So really, anybody who was anybody.
The movers and shakers, literally.
Absolutely.
Because they would
That's the
say that
stature
parties at the
of
different
the man.
properties divided. So
I could look straight across, and Lydia mentioned it, Gull Bay over here. There's a camp over there. And one day, I'm guest services coordinator, and this older gentleman, Bill, very much like you, tall man, beautiful like you, big shock of nice white hair, beautiful, beautiful shock of white hair. And his name was Mr. John Loeb. And I met him, and I was asked to show him around the property. He is the great grandson of Adolf Lewison.
Oh, wow.
So here's a personal story. I'm showing him around. Mr. Loeb, you certainly do you remember this building? Yeah, vaguely. You remember this one? No, I don't remember that. The boathouse? Yeah, I can remember, because we always had to come from Gull Bay over here when I was a kid to visit great grandfather. He was here when I met him. He was just celebrating his 75th birthday, and that was in 2015, so 9 years ago I met him. And he came here and I showed him around, and he was kind of confused about the building, so we've changed a few things. I said, Mr. Lewis, let me take you in one room that has not changed since your great grandfather was here, and that's the room we call the captain's table. You'll walk right through it. And like you, Bill, he got up, good posture, he said, looks around very sternly. He said, Paul, I have never been in this room. I said, Mr. Loeb, you had to eat. Didn't they feed you here? Oh, yes. So from the dining hall, he points to West Lodge over here. See that building? The lobby in that building, the nannies would bring us our meals. And he said, you got to remember Paul, who I am. I grew up in Connecticut, Jewish family. I